The monster in the alley. The night was cold and full of noise. The city of Zara never slept. Lights from tall glass towers glowed above, but the streets below were dark and dangerous. Soldiers in black armor marched through the streets, shouting orders. Lyra held her son close to her chest. His small body was hot with fever, and his breathing was weak. She ran as fast as she could, but her legs were tired. Every corner she turned, she saw more soldiers. They were looking for her. Her son, Seru, had a disease the doctors called red fever. They said it was dangerous. They said it could spread to others. They wanted to take him away and put him in a place where no one ever came back, but Lyra would not let them. She would not lose her child. Stop! A soldier shouted behind her. She ran faster, her heart beating so hard she thought it would break her ribs. She turned into a narrow street, her feet slipping on the wet stones. She could hear the soldiers getting closer. She had to hide. She saw an alley between two broken buildings. It was dark and smelled of garbage, but it was her only chance. She slipped into the alley and pressed her back against the wall, holding Seru close. The soldiers ran past the alley. She held her breath and stayed very still. After a few moments, their footsteps faded away. Lyra closed her eyes for a second. Maybe they were gone. Maybe she was safe for now. But then she felt it. Someone was watching her. She opened her eyes and saw a shadow at the far end of the alley. It was tall, too tall to be a Zarin. Its shoulders were broad, and its arms hung low, like a beast waiting to attack. Two pale eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. She froze. Her blood turned cold. It was a human. On Zara, humans were called monsters. Stories said they were violent, cruel, and hungry for blood. They were banished long ago, but sometimes, it was said, one would sneak back into the city to steal or kill. The human stood very still, watching her. Lyra's legs shook. She wanted to scream, but her throat was dry. If she ran, the soldiers would catch her, but if she stayed... The human took a step closer. She pressed her son tighter against her chest. He whimpered softly, and the sound seemed to echo off the walls. Then, to her surprise, the human spoke. "If you want him to live," the human said in a low voice, "follow me." Lyra blinked. The human's voice was deep, but it didn't sound angry. It didn't sound like a monster. But she didn't move. The human tilted its head slightly, as if thinking. Bennett crouched down, showing its hands. They were empty. "I can help," it said, "but you must decide now." Lyra looked at her son. His face was pale, his lips dry. He needed help, and no one else would help her. "Why?" she asked finally, her voice trembling. The human was quiet for a moment. Then it said, "Because no one else will." She swallowed hard. The soldiers were still out there. She could hear them shouting in the distance. But here, in the alley, the human's glowing eyes did not look cruel. They looked sad. "If you hurt him," she whispered, "I will kill you myself." The human gave a small smile. "Good," it said. "You'll need that spirit." It stood up, turned, and walked deeper into the alley. After a few steps, it looked back at her and nodded. Lyra hesitated for one last second. Then she followed. The alley grew darker and narrower as they walked. The human moved quickly but quietly, and Lyra had to hurry to keep up. The air was cold and damp. Strange smells came from the walls. Old food, rust, and something else she couldn't name. They passed broken doors and piles of trash. Rats scurried away at their footsteps. Finally, they reached a heavy metal door hidden behind a stack of crates. The human pushed the crates aside and opened the door. Inside, it was pitch black. The human looked at her over its shoulder. "Stay close," it sighed, "and stay quiet." Bennett stepped inside. Lyra held Saru close, took a deep breath, and followed the human into the darkness. Behind her, the door closed with a loud clang, and the sound of the soldiers outside faded away. But inside, she felt the weight of something new, something unknown. And for the first time, she wondered if she had made a mistake. Escape route. The air inside the door was heavy and cold. Lyra clutched her son as she stepped into the darkness. The metal door slammed shut behind her, cutting off the faint city noises outside. She couldn't see anything. For a moment, fear gripped her chest. Maybe the stories were true. Maybe humans lured people into the dark and tore them apart. Maybe she had walked into a trap. Then a small light clicked on ahead. The human stood a few steps in front of her, holding a strange glowing stick. The pale light revealed a narrow stone tunnel stretching into the earth. "This way," the human said softly. Lyra hesitated, but when she glanced back at the door, she knew she had no choice. The soldiers were still hunting her outside. If she went back, they would take her son and never return him. She followed. The tunnel sloped downward and twisted like a snake. The walls were rough and damp. Water dripped from cracks above, and the sound echoed through the dark. The human moved quickly, but not carelessly. He glanced over his shoulder now and then, checking that she was still behind him. "Where are you taking me?" she asked finally, her voice low. "Somewhere safe," he replied. "How far?" He didn't answer. After a while, she noticed markings. On the walls, strange symbols scratched into the stone. Some glowed faintly, like tiny stars in the darkness. She had never seen anything like them before. "What are those?" she asked. "Maps," the human said, "for those who know how to read them." She swallowed hard. She didn't know if that was comforting or terrifying. Suddenly, the human stopped. He raised his hand, signaling her to stay quiet. Lyra froze. Then she heard it too. Faint voices ahead. Someone was down here. The human crouched low and turned off the light. Darkness swallowed them both. Lyra's heart raced. She held her son tighter, feeling his weak breath against her neck. Two figures appeared around the corner of the tunnel. They carried bright lanterns and wore black armor. Soldiers. Had they gotten down here? The human pressed himself against the wall and pulled her gently behind him. The soldiers stopped just a few feet away. "She has to be down here somewhere," one said. "Check every passage. Don't let her slip through." They moved on, their lights disappearing into another branch of the tunnel. Lyra let out a shaky breath. But before she could relax, the human grabbed her hand. "No time," he whispered. "They'll double back." He led her down another path, faster now. The tunnel grew steeper and the air colder. At times they had to duck under low ceilings, or squeeze through narrow gaps. Finally, they reached a massive underground chamber. Lyra stopped in awe. The ceiling rose high above, and strange machines stood against the walls, tall, humming, and covered in lights. Some looked like they hadn't been touched in years. Others glowed softly, alive. This was human? She asked. The human gave a small nod. "Before they drove us out," he said, "we built these tunnels. And these machines kept the city alive. Even now, Zayra depends on them, though they pretend to forget who made them." He walked to a control panel and pressed a few buttons. A hidden door on the far side of the chamber slid open. Beyond it, a faint blue light glimmered. "Leads out of the city," he said. Lyra stared at him. "You're helping me escape?" He looked at her, his pale eyes serious. "I told you," he said quietly. "If you want your son to live, you follow me. That is the only way." But before she could answer, a loud clang echoed from behind them. The soldiers had found the chamber. Shouts and footsteps filled the tunnel. "They're here." One soldier barked, Don't let them reach the gate. Lyra's stomach sank. The human moved fast. He grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the blue-lit door. But then, another group of soldiers blocked the path ahead. They were trapped. For a split second, everything went quiet. Lyra thought it was over. Then the human did something she could not believe. He reached into his coat and pulled out a strange silver device. It looked like a ball of wires and lights. He pressed it against the wall and slammed his fist on it. Device exploded in a flash of light and smoke. The ceiling above the soldiers cracked and collapsed, blocking their path with rubble. The humans' hideout. The cold wind stung Lyra's face as she ran through the darkness. She didn't know where she was anymore. Her feet hurt, her lungs burned, and her son felt heavier with every step. But she didn't stop. The humans last. Words still rang in her ears. Go. Now. She kept running until her legs finally gave way. She fell to her knees behind a pile of scrap metal, somewhere on the edge of the city. Her son whimpered softly in her arms. His skin was burning, and his breath came in shallow gasps. Tears filled her eyes. She had escaped the soldiers, but at what cost? And what about the human? Had he survived? She was still catching her breath when a hand reached out of the shadows and touched her shoulder. She jumped and spun around, ready to fight. It was him, the human, covered in dust, blood on his sleeve, but alive. Lyra stared at him, too shocked to speak. I told you not to stop, he said, his voice low but steady. Thought? She began, but her words broke. I'm harder to kill than that, he said, almost with a faint smile. Before she could answer, he motioned for her to follow. This isn't safe. They're still hunting. We need to disappear. Still trembling, she stood and followed him. He led her through a maze of abandoned streets, jumping over fences and crawling through cracks between walls. Finally, they reached what looked like an old warehouse at the edge of the city. The building was dark and silent. The human pushed open a rusty door and guided her inside. For a moment, she couldn't see anything. Then lights flickered on, soft. Golden lights strung across the ceiling. Her breath caught. The place was huge. In one corner was a pile of strange human technology, small machines that hummed and blinked, tools she couldn't even name. In another corner was a makeshift bed with blankets. On the walls were maps, notes, and strange glowing symbols, just like the ones she'd seen in the tunnels. This was his hideout, and it felt nothing like she had imagined. There were no bones, no chains, no signs of cruelty. Just quiet and warmth. He motioned to a chair near the bed. Sit, he said. She sat down, still clutching her son. The human knelt and gently touched the boy's forehead. His fever is high, he murmured. We need to bring it down. He walked to a small cabinet, opened it, and took out a bottle and some cloths. Where did you get all this? Lyra asked finally, her voice hoarse. He didn't look at her. I collect what others throw away, he said. And some I build myself. She watched him work. He dipped the cloth in cold water and pressed it gently to her son's forehead. Then he poured a strange blue liquid into a small spoon and held it to the boy's lips. Drink, he whispered. For a moment, Lyra panicked. What if it was poison? But her son swallowed it weakly, and soon his breathing seemed a little calmer. Couldn't help but stare at the human. You're not what I expected, she said. He gave a short laugh, bitter and quiet. Most aren't, he replied. For a moment there was silence. Then he stood, walked to the corner, and began working on a machine. Lyra watched him, trying to understand. Why? Are you helping us? She asked finally. The human paused. Then he turned and met her eyes. Because no one helped me, he said simply. Those words hung in the air like smoke. Lyra didn't know what to say. She looked around the room again. For the first time in her life, she wondered if everything she had been told about humans was wrong. But before she could speak again, a faint sound outside made them both freeze. Voices. Soldiers. They were close. The human cursed under his breath and switched off the lights. Darkness filled the room. He moved silently to the wall and pressed his ear against it. They found the trail. He whispered. Lyra's stomach sank. The human turned to her, his face hard. "We can't stay here," he said. "But he's still sick," she protested. "If they find us here, we all die," he said flatly. He moved to a panel in the floor and pried it open, revealing a narrow tunnel beneath. "This leads deeper," he said, "somewhere they can't follow." He picked up her son carefully and handed him back to her. "You go first," he said. Lyra hesitated. She looked at the darkness below and at him. "Do you have a plan?" she asked. The human's pale eyes glinted faintly. "I always have a plan," he said. But before she could climb down, the door behind them shook violently. The soldiers were trying to break it down. Lyra climbed into the tunnel, clutching her son, and the human followed close behind, closing the hatch above them just as the door to the warehouse burst open. They crawled through the narrow passage for what felt like hours. The air grew colder and the walls tighter, but the human moved with quiet confidence, as if he knew every inch of the path. Finally, the tunnel opened into a vast cavern, larger than anything she had seen before. Strange lights floated in the air, and below them was a black underground lake that glimmered like glass. Lyra gasped. "What is this place?" she whispered. The human stood beside her, looking out at the water. "This," he said quietly, "is where the real escape begins." Behind them, the faint sound of soldiers shouting echoed through the tunnels, but in front of them lay only darkness and the unknown. And for the first time, Lyra realized the human wasn't just helping her run. He was leading her somewhere she could never return from, somewhere that would change everything. The betrayal, the underground lake, was quiet, almost too quiet. Lyra stood at the edge of the black water, clutching her son. The human was crouched nearby, working on something strange, a small raft made of silver panels and glowing cables. The cavern was huge, with jagged stone walls that disappeared into shadows. It felt ancient, alive, as if it was watching them. Human worked quickly, his hands steady. He didn't speak much, but his movements were sharp and sure. Lyra could tell he had done this before. Her son stirred weakly in her arms, his fever a little lower now, but his face still pale. "How far does this water go?" she finally asked. The human didn't look at her. "Far enough," he said. "Far." "Enough for what?" He glanced at her then, his pale eyes glinting in the dim light. "Far enough to disappear?" Lyra felt a chill at his words, but she said nothing. She watched him finish the raft. It glowed faintly and floated a few inches above the water. He checked something on a small screen and then stood. "It's ready," he said. "We leave now." He helped her climb onto the raft, then stepped on himself. The surface of the water rippled silently as they began to drift across the dark lake. For a while, there was only silence and the faint hum of the raft. Lyra held her son close and stared into the darkness ahead. But then she noticed something strange. The human kept looking. Back over his shoulder, not at the soldiers, but at the shadows behind them. His shoulders were tense, his jaw tight. He was nervous. Lyra frowned. "What is it?" she asked. He didn't answer. Then she heard it too, faint splashes of water, far behind them. She turned and saw movement. Shapes, at least 3 small boats, gliding across the lake after them. Soldiers. "They found us," she whispered. But the human shook his head, his voice low and cold. "Not soldiers," he said. "Worse." Lyra stared at him, confused. "What do you mean?" But before he could answer, a voice echoed across the water. "Well done." "Human," the voice called Dot. It was sharp, mocking. "You led them right to us." Lyra froze. She looked at the human. But he didn't look back at her. Dot, the voice continued. "You always were good at catching prey, and now you've brought us exactly what we wanted." Her blood ran cold. Dot, she grabbed the human's arm. "What are they talking about?" she demanded. He finally looked at her, but his face was different now. Harder, colder. "I told you," he said quietly. "No one helps for free." Lyra stared at him, horrified. "You? You brought me here for them?" The human didn't answer. Behind them, the 3 boats closed in. Figures in dark cloaks stood on them, their eyes glowing faintly in the shadows. One of them spoke again. "Hand her over, human. Your debt will be paid." Lyra's heart was hammering in her chest. She backed away from him on the raft, holding her son tighter. "You lied," she whispered. The human's face was unreadable. "Better me than them," he said flatly. The boats drew closer. Lyra felt trapped. Everything she had believed, that he was helping her, that he was different, shattered in an instant. But then something changed. The human turned his head slowly toward the boats. His hands curled into fists. Dot, and in a quiet, dangerous voice, he said, "No." The figures on the boat stopped. "What did you say?" the leader demanded. The human straightened, his eyes sharp and full of something she hadn't seen before. Rage. "I said no," he repeated. "She and her child are under my protection. You want them? Then come and take them." The leader hissed. "You dare betray us? You dare break your bargain?" The human reached into his coat and pulled out 2 small silver devices. They began to glow and hum. "I dare," he said. Before Lyra could even understand what was happening, the human hurled the devices into the water on either side of the raft. The lake exploded in blinding light. The water churned violently as huge pillars of energy shot upward, cutting off the boats. Screams echoed from the shadows as the cloaked figures scrambled to turn back. Lyra shielded her son, her ears ringing. When the light faded, the boats were gone. Only the black water remained, calm again as if nothing had happened. The human dropped to one knee, breathing hard. Lyra stared at him in shock. You saved me," she whispered. He didn't look at her. "I bought you time," he said quietly. "That's all." Then he stood, his face still grim. "They'll be back," he said. "And next time, I might not be able to stop them." Lyra didn't know what to say. She wanted to scream at him, to curse him, to thank him, to cry. Dot, instead, she just held her son tighter and whispered, "Why did you change your mind?" The human looked at her finally, his eyes dark and tired. "Because," he said, "I remembered what it feels like to be hunted." For a long moment, there was only silence between them. Then he turned back to the controls and set the raft. "Moving again. Rest while you can," he said. "The hardest part is still ahead." And as they drifted into the darkness once more, Lyra couldn't help but wonder, who was this man really? A monster? A savior? Or something else entirely? The water stretched endlessly ahead of them, and behind them, faint whispers still echoed in the shadows. The betrayal had happened, but the story was far from over. The price of mercy, the underground. Lake seemed endless. Lyra sat on the raft, holding her son close, her eyes heavy but unable to close. Every shadow in the water felt like it was watching her. Every ripple felt like a whisper of something waiting below. The human stood at the front of the raft, silent and tense. His hands gripped the controls tightly, his face hard as stone. He hadn't spoken to her since he had destroyed the pursuers. Lyra wanted to ask him so many questions. Why he betrayed them, why he saved her, who those dark figures really were. But the words caught in her throat. Instead, she just watched him, wondering who he really was. After what felt like hours, faint light appeared ahead, a dock old and cracked, rising out of the black water like the bones of some dead beast. The human steered the raft to the dock and jumped off, tying it to a rusted post. "We walk from here," he said without looking at her. Lyra stood slowly, her legs stiff, her son still asleep in her arms. She followed him onto the dock. The air here was different, colder, and heavy with the smell of earth and iron. They climbed a narrow set of stone stairs that led up from the dock. At the top was a massive metal door. The human placed his hand on a glowing panel beside it. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the door groaned and slowly opened. Beyond it was a vast underground hall, dark, silent, and empty. Rows of strange machines lined the walls. Some still blinked faintly. Others lay broken and dead. In the center of the hall was a single chair, lit by a pale beam of light from far above. The human walked toward the chair. Lyra followed, her footsteps echoing. When they reached the center, he finally spoke. "This is where it ends," he said quietly. Lyra frowned. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small black device. He turned it over in his hands, staring at it like it was something precious or dangerous. "This," he said finally, "is what they wanted." Lyra looked at the device. It was small, ordinary looking. "What is it?" she asked. "The cure," he said. Her eyes widened. "The cure? For the fever?" He nodded slowly. "For your son, for many others. A formula, a code, hidden inside this." Lyra's chest tightened. "You had this the whole time?" she whispered. He glanced at her then, his face hard. "I stole it years ago," he said. "They've been hunting me ever since." Lyra's hands shook. "Then why didn't you? Why didn't you just use it?" The human laughed bitterly. "Because it's not free," he said. Before she could speak, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hall. Lyra turned and saw soldiers pouring through the open door. Dozens of them, black armor, guns raised. They had found them. The human sighed. He slipped the device into Lyra's hands. "Take it," he said. "What?" "No." He grabbed her shoulder, his eyes fierce now. "Take it. Run. Don't stop. Don't look back. Find the surface. Use it to save him. Do you understand?" Lyra shook her head, tears in her eyes. "But what about you?" The human smiled. Faintly. "They don't want me alive," he said. "I've always known how this ends." The soldiers raised their weapons. The human turned toward them, arms at his sides, calm. "Go," he murmured. But Lyra couldn't move. Not at first. Then. The soldiers shouted, and he shouted back, "Run!" That broke her. She clutched the device in one hand and her son in the other, and ran toward the far end of the hall. Behind her, she heard the first shots fired, the sound of metal hitting stone, and his voice, one last time, shouting at the soldiers, drawing them away from her. She ran through a narrow passage, her breath ragged, her heart pounding. She didn't dare look back, but in her mind, she could still see him, standing in that circle of light, facing an army alone. She ran through tunnels, climbed broken ladders, crawled through narrow gaps, until finally she saw a faint sliver of daylight ahead. She stumbled out into the open air. The sky above was pale and cold, but it was sky. She fell to her knees, clutching her son and the device. For a long moment, she just sat there, gasping, shaking. She had escaped, but at what cost? Lyra looked at the small black device in her hand, the cure, and she whispered softly, as if he could still hear her, "Why did you do it?" But she already knew the answer, because he had said it before, because no one else will dot behind her. Deep in the earth, faint echoes of gunfire still rang, and she knew. A price of mercy had been paid dot by him. Asterisk. The rescue the sky was gray. Lyra stood at the edge of the rocks, clutching the black device in one hand and her son in the other. She had escaped. She had the cure, but her heart was heavy every time she closed her eyes. She saw him, the human, standing in that circle of light, facing the soldiers alone. She heard the shots, the shouting, and she couldn't forget the look on his face. He had given everything to save her and her child, and she had just run. Lyra stared at the device in her hand, this small, cold thing that could save her son and maybe countless others, but at what cost? Her son stirred weakly, his fever still burning, his breath shallow. She looked down at him, then back at the dark hole in the ground where she had climbed out. Her hands trembled. She couldn't leave him there. Not like that. Not after what he had done. She stood slowly and pressed her forehead against her son's. "Stay strong," she whispered. Then she wrapped him in her coat, tucked the device into her pocket, and laid him gently under a rocky ledge where he would be safe for a little while. She took one last look at him, and then turned back to the hole. And she climbed down. The tunnels felt colder now. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound louder, but she didn't stop. She moved quickly, retracing her steps. The air was thick with smoke and dust now, and faint echoes of gunfire still bounced off the walls. At one point, she stumbled on a bloodstain smeared across the floor, swallowed hard, and kept moving. She didn't know what she would find when she reached him, but she had to try. She owed him that much. When she finally reached the great underground hall, her breath caught. The room was wrecked. Machines lay in pieces. The chair in the center was scorched and cracked. The air smelled of burnt metal and ozone. And the human. He was still there, on his knees in the circle of light, his hands chained behind his back, his head bowed. Soldiers stood all around him, weapons raised. And in front of him stood the cloaked figure from before, the one who had spoken on the lake. "You disappoint me," the figure said, his voice sharp and cruel. "You could have lived. You could have kept your word. But you chose them over us." The human lifted his head slightly, his pale eyes meeting the figure's. "I chose what was right," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. The figure sneered. "There is no right," he spat. "There is only survival. And now you'll have neither." The figure raised his hand. Lyra's breath caught. She didn't think. She moved. From her hiding place in the shadows, she spotted a loose metal pipe on the floor. She grabbed it and crept closer, her heart pounding in her ears. When the figure stepped forward, she struck. The pipe connected with the back of the figure's head, and he crumpled to the ground. The soldiers spun around in shock. Before they could react, she was already moving, swinging the pipe wildly, knocking weapons out of their hands, shouting to distract them. The human twisted in his chains, his eyes widening when he saw her. "Are you mad?" he shouted. "Maybe," she hissed, breaking the chains with the pipe. The human stood slowly, rubbing his wrists, a strange smile on his lips. "I told you to run," he said, "and I told you," she shot back, "that if you hurt my son, I'd kill you myself. But you didn't. So now, get up." Together, they fought through the stunned soldiers. The human moved like lightning now, grabbing weapons, striking with brutal precision. Lyra followed, swinging her pipe, ducking shots, dodging blows. At one point, the human glanced at her and laughed. A real laugh this time, sharp and full of something wild. "You're better at this than I thought," he said. "You're worse at dying than you thought," she snapped back. Finally, the last soldier fell, groaning on the floor. The room was silent again, except for their heavy breathing. The human leaned against the chair, blood dripping from his arm, but his grin remained. "You shouldn't have come back," he said softly. Lyra stared at him, her chest heaving. "I couldn't leave you here," she said. He looked at her, and for the first time, his hard expression softened. "Why?" he asked simply. She stepped closer, her hands still shaking. "Because," she hesitated, "you're not the monster they say you are." The human chuckled weakly, shaking his head. "You're wrong," he murmured. "I am, but maybe. Not today." They didn't wait. They moved quickly through the tunnels, helping each other climb, carrying each other when they stumbled. When they finally reached the surface again, the gray sky above never looked so bright that her son was still there. Where? She had left him, wrapped in her coat. The human knelt beside him, checked his pulse, and nodded faintly. "He's strong," he said, "like his mother." Lyra stared at him, her throat tight. "You could have let me go," she whispered. Stood slowly, looking out at the horizon. "I already did," he said. "But you came back." They stood there in silence for a moment, the wind cold against their skin. Then the human looked down at her and gave the smallest of smiles. "You saved me," he said quietly. Lyra shook her head. "No," she replied. Softly, "You saved us first." The human's smile faded, but there was something new in his eyes, something that looked almost like hope. And for the first time, she didn't see a monster anymore. She saw a man. Asterisk the truth. The wind howled. Across the barren hills, Lyra stood at the edge of a cliff, a small black device in her hand, her son asleep on her shoulder. Behind her, the human leaned against a rock, quiet, his eyes on the horizon. For the first time, there was no sound of soldiers, no footsteps, no gunfire, just silence. But it was not peace, it felt like the calm before something bigger. She turned the device over in her hands. It felt heavier now. "This cure," she said softly, not looking at him. "Why didn't you use it before?" The human didn't answer at first. Then he spoke, his voice low and tired. "Because truth has a cost," he said. She frowned and glanced at him. "What does that mean?" He finally pushed himself off the rock and walked closer, his pale eyes fixed on her. "You think this will save him?" he said, nodding at the device. "And it might. But it will also expose everything they've tried to hide." Lyra clutched her son tighter. "Expose what?" she demanded. The human stood beside her now, looking down at the sleeping boy. "They created the fever," he said simply. Lyra froze. "What?" she whispered. "They made it," he repeated. "The disease, the panic, the stories about humans being monsters, all of it, to control you, to keep you afraid, to keep you obedient." Lyra shook her head, stepping back. "That's not true." But the human's gaze didn't waver. "You've seen it yourself," he said. "The soldiers don't protect you. They hunt you. The doctors don't heal you. They take your sick, and they never come back. And me? I'm the monster they told you to fear." "But who was it that helped you when no one else would?" Lyra's hands trembled. She wanted to deny it. But deep inside, she knew he was right. Everything she had been taught was a lie. She looked at the device again. "This has the proof," she whispered. He nodded slowly. "And that," he said, "is why they will never stop hunting you." She stared at him, her chest tight. "You risked everything," she said quietly. "Why?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a moment his hard expression softened. "Because," he said softly, "someone has to." They stood in silence for a while. Then the human turned and started walking down the hill. "Where are you going?" she called after him. He stopped but didn't turn around. "They'll keep coming," he said. "For you, for the boy, for the truth." Someone has to keep them busy. Lyra's heart sank. You're leaving? She asked. He gave a faint smile over his shoulder. I was never staying, he said. But before he could take another step, she ran after him and grabbed his arm. You can't, she said. He looked at her, surprised. You think you can fight them alone? She demanded. The human was quiet for a long time. Then he chuckled, a low, bitter sound. Not alone, he said. And then, very softly, he added, but better me than you. Her grip tightened on his arm. You don't get to decide that, she said fiercely. He met her gaze, and something strange flickered in his eyes, a mix of pride and regret. You're stronger than you think, he murmured. And you're not as broken as you pretend. She shot back. He stared at her for a long moment, and he finally nodded. Maybe, he admitted. They stood there on the hill, under the gray sky, facing the unknown together. For the first time, she saw him not just as a human, not just as a man, but as something more, someone who carried the weight of the world and still chose to fight. And for the first time, he looked at her not just as a mother, not just as a refugee, but as something more, someone who refused to give up, even on him. The wind picked up. He turned to her and spoke one last time. Keep the boy safe, he said. And you? She asked. He smiled faintly. I'll keep them busy, he said. Then he handed her a small card, a thin metal disc with strange markings. If you survive, he said, find me. And without another word, he disappeared into the mist. Stood there, holding her son and the device, her heart heavy, but her eyes clear. She looked at the horizon, where the human had vanished, and whispered softly, You're wrong about one thing. You're not a monster. You're the best of us. She turned and walked down the hill, into the unknown, carrying the cure, the truth, and the memory of the man who risked everything. And though she didn't know what waited ahead, she knew one thing for certain. The story was not over. It was just beginning. The end.